talk. And so, yeah, so I'm going to be speaking about the importance of grasslands in the era of climate breakdown. So a little bit about myself. I am at the University of Oxford doing my PhD. I'm a fourth year student, so I've got about another year or so before I hand in. And my background is in environmental sciences, but I've kind of switched towards sort of plant ecology and grassland research. So that is my background. And so so let's get sort of started. So if you were to sort of approach someone, let's say in a park or some kind of green space, and you would ask them how many different types of plants can they see if they kind of look down at their feet, chances are quite a lot of people might say, oh, I'm not really sure, or it all just kind of looks like grass to me. Or like, oh, maybe I can spot a few, but I'm not really sure. It all kind of looks the same to me. And it's quite interesting. I've done this exercise with biology undergrads, and I get a similar sort of response where they can name sort of a few species, but they generally don't know very much about grasslands, especially if they're sort of just coming in from their sort of A levels and their first year students. And I think this sort of speaks to the sort of general lack of awareness of and societal awareness about plants, and being able to describe what we kind of see around us. And this has been termed as plant blindness, or increasingly calling it plant awareness disparity. So these are just some of the species that I managed to spot very quickly just by looking at it. If I was to look down, and this is from my field site, which you'll hear about a little bit later. So if we do think about plants, if we're thinking sort of academic and sort of policy sphere, when plants are mentioned, it tends to be, as I like to call them, the charismatic megaflora, so like the trees and the forests. And they're often viewed as like sort of the top of the plant pyramid. And this sort of ties in with sort of this Western view of like ecological succession. So it's to do with the process of an ecological community changing in structure over time. And that forests tend to be like the climax community. And what we tend to see is through sort of these Western ideas and with colonialism, there's these ideas of like the right vegetation, and which tends to be like, oh, there's the trees. And this has been rooted in a lot of these colonized countries, particularly in the tropics. And we still see evidence of this today in terms of attitudes towards everything like tropical grasslands or savannas, and they're often labeled as degraded forest and of low conservation value, which can be farther from the truth. And we sort of get this bias towards trees and forests. It's evident sort of in the academic literature. If you were to sort of pull together all the literature about sort of restoration, you see a lot more studies that are to do with forest restoration compared to grassland restoration. And obviously, academic studies, this bias in academic studies is carried forward into policy. So if we were to see sort of in the last decade or so, a lot of the sort of policy statements and pledges in relation to sort of climate change and the ecological crisis, we're seeing a lot of these pledges to do with restoration are to do with sort of tree planting. So for example, two big ones are like the Bonn Challenge, which was set up about 10 years ago by the German government to with the goal of restoring 500 million hectares of degraded land by 2030 by planting trees. Or more recently, the Trillion Trees Challenge, which is a tree planting initiative which is endorsed by a number of organizations to plant 1 million trees by 2030. And quite a lot of these initiatives, they're well-meaning and they're trying to find solutions to the climate or ecological sort of breakdown, but care isn't always taken about where these reforestation initiatives take place. And sometimes they occur on naturally occurring grasslands, and they're trying to where trees hadn't been present for millennia or for a very long time. So this kind of speaks in general. So this is sort of setting the scene about this sort of underappreciation for grasslands. So now, if we turn our attention from looking up to looking down, let's start with like, what are grasslands? And it's quite interesting because my background wasn't in grasslands until I started my PhD, and I was trying to look up like what actually is a grassland. And surprisingly, there isn't a agreed upon definition of what is a grassland. So like the simplest definition is basically a habitat that is dominated by grass species in the Poaceae family. But a more sort of inclusive definition would be sort of habitats that are dominated by sort of low-growing, non-woody plants, and with few instances of woody vegetation. So grasslands are not just grass species. There are other non-grass species there as well. We sort of describe these as forbs. And if we think about a few sort of facts about grasslands, so if we, based on sort of satellite imagery, it's been worked out that grasslands occupy the largest area by land type. So that's above like forests and agriculture. And grasslands cover about a third of the land surface on Earth. And this figure sort of varies between 20 and 40%, depending on how you define what a grassland is, as I was explaining before. And grasslands occur on every continent except Antarctica. So they're very widespread. And grasslands store about a third of the terrestrial carbon. And the majority of that carbon is actually stored below ground. And that's about, I've seen some studies where they said about 90% of this carbon is stored below ground. And these are sort of longer term stores of carbon. And other important aspects of grasslands is that they provide important habitats supporting pollinating insects, soil invertebrates, and soil microbes as well. And if we're thinking about sort of ecosystem services, grasslands are very important in the nutrient cycling. So like decaying sort of plant matter being degraded, and then the nutrients released back into the soil. And also if we're thinking about sort of water transport in the hydrological cycle, excuse me, they play an important role. And if we think also of like floodplains as well. And also we shouldn't forget that grasslands are really important for us as well. So they have a cultural significance, and they're good for our mental health and amenities and sort of ecotourism. And I'm sure that we've realized through the pandemic, going on our sort of daily walks, how much we've appreciated sort of grassy areas in the natural world in general. So if we think about grasslands and the climate and ecological breakdown, just sort of a side note, I like to use the phrase climate breakdown because I think over climate change, as I think it better communicates the severity of the crisis that we're in. So I tend to refer to it that way. So if we're thinking about the different impacts that the climate and ecological breakdown has on grasslands, it's actually there are multiple threats that they're facing. So I'm just going to show some of them here. So we have things like invasive and non-native species, which are encroaching on these grasslands and are changing the community of these grasslands. Other threats include urbanization, so sort of urban sprawl and resulting in sort of the land use change and conversion of grasslands to support human populations. There's also impacts of fire, or sometimes lack of fire, because some natural grasslands are managed through fire. And things like agricultural expansion are also threatening grasslands and also domestic livestock. And another important one, which will be the focus of most of the rest of the talk, is the impact of drought. And I think it's important to note that each of these impacts tend not to act in isolation. So the presence of one of these threats can exacerbate the state of grassland. So, for example, if you have a high abundance of invasive grasses in a grassland, you could have an increase in fire risk, and that can affect the recovery of that grassland if those invasive species are not adapted to these fire-prone regions. So it's important to think about all of these in concert. So if we're thinking about drought impacts, as we sort of all know, there's been numerous sort of reports, generally sort of globally, droughts are expected to increase in frequency, duration, and intensity across the world. And that has serious consequences for us as humans, but also other living beings as well. And if we think specifically with plants, there's a number of factors that really impact plants from droughts. So drought decreases the amount of water availability for plants. And with reduced water availability in plants, it increases the stress on the plant and it makes it more susceptible to diseases. It also impacts the ability to grow properly and reduces their sort of productivity, so how much biomass they can accumulate. And this also increases the risk of mortality to the plants. And I think a lesser known sort of impact is also the reduced water availability impacts below ground. So a lot of plants have relationships with soil microbes or fungi, and the lower water availability can impact these relationships, which means that the plants will grow less well. And interestingly, in Europe, the study of droughts in grasslands is lacking. I think we have this idea, especially in the UK, that it's raining all the time, or like, why should we be concerned about droughts? And it's not an issue. So there's been generally quite a lack of studies, although some are sort of coming in about, for example, the drought that happened in 2003, and I think there's some studies starting to trickle through about the one that happened in 2018 and 2019. So it's quite funny when I describe my sort of research, because I work on the effect of drought on grasslands, that people are quite puzzled by why I'm sort of studying this, especially like related to the UK. So so my work, let's see if this works, takes place at a field site at Whiten Woods, and it's called the Raindrop drought experiment. And I don't know how many of you have been to Whiten Woods. It's quite a famous woods in the UK. It's very well studied. But despite its name, Whiten Woods, there are actually a number of grasslands, grassland habitats on the estate. And this is the site that I work in. I'll just play that again. And you can see those sort of white little squares are the drought experiment. And so I'm broadly interested in understanding how the drought impacts the plant community structure. So that means which kind of plants are there and how abundant are they, and functioning. So that is like, how productive is this plant community? So how much accumulation of plant matter is there? And does the drought affect these two sort of processes? So I mostly focus on one particular grass species, which is called the false brome, or Bracopodium silvaticum. And oops. But before I go into my my species that I work with, I just want to give a bit of history to the Raindrop experiment. So if you were to sort of stand at the Raindrop experiment 165 million years ago, you would be it'd be quite toasty and warm, because you'd be in a shallow tropical sea full of corals. And this is some of the coral that you can find at the site, and it's sort of strewn kind of everywhere, and like you can just get a shovel and just kind of make a hole and you'll find a lot of that coral. So sometimes it's quite big, kind of as big as your head, and other times you get little small pieces of coral. And that's important for the underlying geology. So the underlying geology of these corals is important for like the soils and the plant community on top, because it's a calcareous grassland, and that has special properties. And then if we were to fast forward several million years to about the 1940s, this site was sort of during the war was any sort of spare land that happened sort of around the country was converted to sort of farmland or arable crops. And so this happened at the site for about 40 odd years. And so they're growing various cereal crops. I don't know the specifics of it. We're trying to look in sort of the archives, but it wasn't very successful because, as I was saying before, with the underlying geology, when you have these big chunks of coral which they ploughed up in order to plant the crops, they're not very good in the sense as poor nutrient. It has a poor nutrient status, and it hasn't got very good water holding capacity because it's quite freely draining. So only really sort of specialized, quite specialized plants tend to grow at this site because it has quite a high pH as well. So yeah, so they abandoned that in the 1980s, and then since the 1980s, it's been recovering. And so no seeds are sort of planted there, they just left it, and it was natural colonization of plant species there. And it was managed in such a way because it's surrounded by woodlands. You've got oak, beech, and some ash as well, trees around. So it was so if you were to leave that site unmanaged, it would eventually turn into a woodland. And to prevent that, they put some sort of sheep grazing on there as well. And then in 2016, the Raindrop experiment was set up, and it's managed. So these are basically some shelters that have been placed, quite low tech sort of shelters, to intercept sort of the incoming rainfall to simulate a drought. And it was decided for sort of ethical reasons not to put the sheep back on because there are cables and they could sort of hurt themselves. So it still has to be maintained and managed. So it's sort of managed as a sort of hay meadow, and it's cut twice a year. So it's cut just after sort of peak growing season, which is kind of early July, after sort of ground nesting birds have left. That's when sort of we get the go ahead to cut, and then it's cut at the end of the growing season, which is around sort of the end of September. So that's sort of how it's managed. And this is a pretty special site. So around the UK, we've actually lost 97% of our wildflower meadows and species-rich grasslands, due to kind of what I was saying earlier, because a lot of that land has been converted for agricultural purposes. So it's quite a special site, and also the fact that it's its underlying geology, which is the calcareous, so the fossilized coral. So so since the 1980s, it's been recovering. So that is how many years? 40 plus years. And today there's over 100 different species. I think from the records there's 107 species. And I've just highlighted some of them here because there's too many to put on there. And I have been distracted with my camera at the site, trying to take all these like beautiful pictures of the amazing variety of plants that you can find there. So I've just highlighted some here, and they're quite interesting in terms of their some of these in terms of their sort of survival strategy. So you've got the legumes, which I mentioned earlier, which have this special partnership with rhizobia bacteria in their roots, which help them acquire nitrogen for the plants, because at this site is quite nutrient poor. So you get species like white clover, red clover, bird's foot trefoil, you get black medic. There's also wild licorice, which I was quite surprised to find, which I think is quite rare around Oxfordshire as well. And then you get, I call them kind of the sneaky plants. So you get the parasitic plants. So there's the Orobanche minor, there's yellow rattle, red bartia. And these are sort of, I call them, yeah, they're quite cheeky because they with their roots, they attach to other plants and grasses and forbs, and they siphon off the nutrients. So they're kind of a little bit lazy in some way because they don't create their own food. They don't photosynthesize. So there's some that are like fully parasitic, so the Orobanche minor, which deals like all the nutrients, and then there's some that are kind of like, I've seen it described as like double agents. So like sometimes they do photosynthesize and they top it up with siphoning off nutrients. So that's like the yellow rattle and the red bartia. So these are just some of the selection of plants that are at the site, and it's really beautiful. Like during June and July, seeing all these beautiful colours. So it tends to be sort of the pinks and the yellows, and there's also two species of orchid there. So there's the beet orchid, which has declined since I've kind of been working at the site. I think it's quite struggling a bit with the drought in general. And there's also the pyramidal orchid, which seems to be doing okay. So these are just, yeah, some of the selection of the species. So in terms of sort of what I do, so out of all those about 100 species, I chose to work with one of them more closely, which is the Bracopodium silvaticum, or false brome. And this is a type of sort of bunch grass. And it kind of has quite a tight sort of bunch, and you can kind of tell it's like an individual plant, which is a bit different from some of the other grass species, which tend to be quite sort of clonal. They're a bit sort of, you can think of them a bit like, you know, strawberry send out runners. They kind of do that with some of the grasses, and there's this big sort of mats. Everything like tall grass or Bracopodium pinnatum tends to grow like that, and it's quite hard to tell what an individual is. And for my research, I needed to know, be able to identify an individual. So what I've been doing over since 2019, I've been doing a yearly census on 140 tagged individuals. So I went around, so as you can see sort of in the picture, with these little kebab sticks that I got online, and then just giving them a unique code. I sort of tagged these individuals, and I'm interested to see what effect from the experimental drought treatments, what effect it has on their sort of survival. So in this yearly census, I go back each year and check, is this one, so is AD3BP11, is it still alive or is it not? And if it is alive, has it grown and or shrunk? Because plants have the ability to shrink when conditions aren't great. And if it has grown, I then ask the question, like, has it reproduced? Are the little sort of babies around? And I also count the number of leaves on these individuals and a number of flowering stems, and then the length of the flowering spikelet. So I do a number of sort of activities with them. And then I'll be measuring next year certain sort of characteristics of the plant. So leaf area, its height, and its sort of thickness and other traits, to build up a picture to see if what is basically the effect of this drought of them. So taking different perspectives. Other parts of my fieldwork involve, there's a lot of bending down. So I have, as part of the census that I take every year, I gather information about sort of how the size of my target plants, so like the area basically. And I have these sheets, which is what I'm holding up here, which measures sort of the area. So it's very low tech. It's these sort of acetate sheets, and then I with a Sharpie, I just sort of go around it, and which is what I'm doing on the picture on the left, and just get a sort of rough area of those individuals. And then I have a new sheet for each year. And then I photograph those sheets, and then I extract the sort of area from it using some fancy programming. And what also I look at is in terms of how sort of productive that plant community is, with the rest of sort of the team that are involved at Raindrop. We measure the sort of above ground biomass using sort of clippers over like a set area. And then, so it's basically just a bunch of mostly grass. And then it takes several hours to then sort those samples, which is what I'm doing here on the picture on the left. So I usually just have my headphones in and listen to a podcast, and just like, it's quite a relaxing activity actually, of sorting them out into these we call them sort of functional groups. So it's like the grasses go in one pile, the legumes go in one pile, another pile, and then you have sort of the forbs, so the other flowering plants that are not legumes or grasses. And sometimes we get moss as well, and occasionally some woody, like hawthorn. So these are sort of put into different piles, and they go in their special envelopes that are carefully labeled. And then they go into the oven for about day or so, at about 70 degrees to dry them. So not to like cook them, but just to sort of dry them, and then they are weighed. So that's sort of some of the sort of activities that are involved sort of my field work. And in terms of looking at the structure of the communities, I didn't have a picture here, but I also so the rest of the team, we use quadrats. So it's just like this square that you place. It's a 1 meter quadrat that you place over a given area, and then you record all the species that you find within that set area. And that gives you a type. You do it each year, you can kind of monitor the types of species that you have and how abundant they are. So we use percentage cover as a measure. And so yeah, so I've seen some interesting observations. So I'm still doing the data analysis, but I can speak about sort of the things that I've sort of noticed. So I've noticed a bit of a sort of community shift. So there's been an increase in tall grass, which is the Bracopodium pinnatum, which I was describing earlier, which kind of spreads. It doesn't have nice sort of bunchiness to it. And I've also noticed less bird's foot trefoil. And I'm wondering if it's to do with, so a lot of the legumes have quite high water requirements, because it's to do with the link with the bacterial association they have when they fix nitrogen. So the bacteria really need a lot of water to complete sort of that process. So I'm wondering if the drought is affecting their ability to do this. So they're not able to grow and they're dying off more. So we've seen the presence of sort of some other smaller legumes. And also what's quite interesting is that the tagged individuals that I had of my Bracopodium silvaticum has sort of moved. So I probably should have said this before, but they're tagged and they have a specific location on this sort of X and Y coordinates. So I know each year I go to the same individual. And what I've noticed when I do my drawings with the sort of Sharpies, that they've actually moved. And some of them, especially in the drought treatments, they're kind of moving away from the drought and moving towards the outside of the shelter where the conditions are nicer. So I was like, oh, that's very interesting. And I was like, oh, I need to read up more about this. So yeah, so plants do have the ability to sort of move. So it's only, I think most of it's maybe like 5 centimeters or so. So I thought that was quite interesting. And in terms of shrinkage, so what I've noticed in the drought areas is that there's quite a lot of shrinkage of the plants. So they've, year on year, they've kind of shrunk more. So when conditions aren't great for some plants, they have this ability, instead of sort of dying off, it's like the preservation mechanism, where they basically just sort of shrink and they stay small because they require less resources if they're small. And when resources are better, then they will grow. So they can do this sort of backwards and forwards, like growth and shrinkage. But interestingly, I also saw some shrinkage in the sort sort of irrigated plot where it's receives more rainfall. And I wonder if that's to do with maybe sort of competition or something. So if there's a lot of nutrients, in this case water, then the plants go sort of mad and start growing a lot, and some species might not be sort of crowded out. So some interesting sort of dynamics there. And I guess sort of wrapping up my work, sort of the wider context of this. So this drought experiment is part of a network of experiments, other drought experiments in 127 other locations, or in grassland areas around the world. So we have places in Australia, South Africa, other places in Europe, and quite a lot in America as well. I think a few in South America as well. There tends to be a bias towards North America and Europe, but nonetheless, it's quite a good spread around the world. I think it's important. So they're doing sort of similar work as well, and it's the same sort of setup. So there's power in numbers in trying to understand the impact of droughts from a sort of wider context. So we all will feed in our data into this sort of the larger sort of database. And I think it's important to understand the impacts of droughts in sort of future here specifically, or just in general when researching the effect of droughts on grasslands, for sort of conservation managers when we're trying to when they're trying to sort of adapt and sort of think about sort of restoration as well. If they have sort of information about what types of plants have a higher resilience and lower mortality towards drought, that's really important in terms of perhaps which plant species would be better to seed or plant in certain areas, and sort of planning and trying to mitigate for the future as well. So that's sort of the wider context to it. And I guess I'll just sort of finish by saying that if we had sort of nature awards ceremony, I think grasslands should definitely be awarded the best supporting role, because I think often forests tend to get sort of the best actor award, and it's nothing against them. I think they should be working sort of together and not overshadowing the importance of grasslands. So they definitely should get the supporting role, because they're very important for supporting a wide variety of pollinating insects and birds and soil microbes and worms and all kinds of different species, but also for their importance for fighting against climate breakdown through sort of carbon storage. As I said before, they store about 1/3 of the terrestrial carbon, and mostly in the soils, and these sort of longer term storage of carbon. So I'll sort of leave it there. Thank you for listening. All these amazing people helped me. So I want to thank them as well, helped me. So I didn't do this all alone. And yeah, they've been really amazing. So I look forward to hearing your questions. And it was, fun to talk to you.
Thank you, Sara. That was brilliant.